Perek Tesvav Mishnah Beis. This Mishnah now goes on to discuss its continuation of the halachas of kosher and mateh, and the Mishnah sets out the ones which are not osam in Torah, as we discussed in the previous Mishnah, but those knots which involve isurei derabanan, and even those knots which category 3 are actually mutar lechatchila to make on Shabbos. So says the Mishnah, Yesh lecha kasharim she'ein chayovin aleihen kekesha hagamolin uchekesha saponim. There are some types of knots which you can make on Shabbos which would not involve a chiyuv min haTorah, like the kesha hagamolin, like the knots that the camel drivers would make, uchekesha saponim, or the knots that the sailors would make. And then, very strangely, the Mishnah leaves it there and doesn't tell you what they are, because the next line of the Mishnah, kasheres isha, etc., is going on to describe those knots which are actually mutar lechatchila to make. So the Gemara explains, the Gemara in Kuf Yud Beis Amud Aleph in Shabbos sort of fills in the gaps and tells me what the rest of the Mishnah goes on to say. The Mishnah is referring to the next part of the knot used in the camel or the sailor's initial chiyuv chatos note. For example, we described in the previous Mishnah that the camel's knot, which involves a chiyuv d'oraisa, would be that ring of leather around the nose of the camel. That is inserted permanently. But then you would take another sort of rope and you would tie that to the ring which has been inserted in the camel's nose, and you would tie that to that ring. Now that tying is only going to be a temporary knot. Why? Because you don't intend to keep it there permanently. You'll leave it there for a week or two or whatever, but you would never intend to keep it there permanently. And similarly, with regard to the knots that a sailor would make, in the front of the ship he would take this leather piece and would wrap it around and make a permanent knot. That is a chiyuv d'oraisa, as we mentioned in the previous Mishnah. But then he would take some ropes and he would attach it to that leather ring, and then he would make non-permanent types of knots, and he would to use to pull the ship, etc., etc., or to keep it docked properly, etc. So that is what this Mishnah is referring to, and that would involve only a chiyuv d'rabbanan. Again, it refers back to the machlokas rishonim that we mentioned in the previous Mishnah, i.e., according to Rashi and the Rosh, the sole criteria is that of permanence. So therefore, the previous Mishnah referred to chiyuvei d'oraisa because those knots that a person was making were 100% permanent, he would keep it there forever. The knots referring to in the first line of this Mishnah are those knots which a person would keep in place for a week or two or whatever it would be. The third criteria, which we're going to go on to discuss now, that a person would sort of undo on a very regular basis, and therefore that would be mutar lechatchila. According to the Rif and the Rambam, again, the two criteria according to the Rif and the Rambam would be A, permanence, and B, it has to be a professional knot. And if it's lacking one of those two, it reduces it to a drabonon. So pshat in this Mishnah would be that we're talking about a professional knot, but since it's not done permanently, then it would only be a drabonon. Okay, continues the Mishnah. Kesheres isha miftach chaluka. A woman can tie a knot on her blouse. It's some sort of cloak that she would wrap around, and she would tie one end over there, and she would tie the other end over there. Since she would undo it on a daily basis, therefore that would be mutar lechatchila for her to make it, because that is not considered any degree of permanence. Similarly, the chutei sevacha. Chutei sevacha is some sort of hairnet. We discussed earlier in the Mesechta with regard to Hotzah and Shabbos, but it's some sort of tichel that a woman would wear, and she would tie it immediately on top of her hair, and she would sort of tie the end together to tighten it up. And when she would take it off, then she would undo it. She wouldn't just rip it off quite quickly, because she would be protective not to pull out any of her hair, her real hair. So therefore, this hairnet that a woman wears, she would undo it before taking it off, and since she would undo it on a regular basis, that's not considered a permanent knot, and therefore be mutar lechatchila for her to do it. Continues the Mishnah. V'shel piskiyah. Piskiyah is some sort of belt. It's like a thick leather belt that a woman would wear around her waist, and she would tie it. So she would undo it on a regular basis. Therefore, it has no degree of permanence, and again, it's mutar lechatchila. Uretzuas minol v'sandal. the straps of shoes or sandals, the Gemara defines different types of straps that we're talking about, but certainly a knot, laces that a person would do would tie and untie on a very regular basis that would not violate even an Issa Drabonon of kosher and matzah. V'nodos yayin v'shemen. These are sort of flasks or big canteens, leather canteens of oil or of wine, and there would be two pouches. There would be, sort of imagine a big canteen, leather canteen, filled with oil or wine, and there'd be one opening on one side and one opening on the other side, and you would tie the one opening over there and one opening over there. And the chiddush is over here that even though I might have thought that you could leave one permanently tied and just use one, the chiddush is that no, that's not the derech of doing it, and you would occasionally need to open both because you want to sort of get rid of a large quantity, or whatever it is, we're not choshish that a person would leave one of those ends, one of those two openings, tied permanently. Or kadeira shel basar. Similarly, if a person's got a pot of food, of meat cooking, and you then you take a cloth over it, and you tie a sort of a string around the cloth to keep it on as a lid on this pot. Again, a person would undo that on a regular basis. He's not going to leave it there permanently. He wants to eat his basar, so therefore that would not be a problem of kosher or matzah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, kosher nifnei ha-behema b'shvil shelo teitzei. An animal is in a pen and in an enclosure, and there's no door there, that a person wants to tie the animal in on Shabbos. So he takes a rope and he sort of ties to one pole on one sort of just the one side of the gate where there's an opening, and then he would take the rope and put it across and tie it on the other side, and thereby he would keep the animal in on Shabbos. He would prevent the animal from going out on Shabbos. That would be mutter to make it. Now, the reason why that's mutter is because we're not choshesh that he's going to sort of leave one side permanently tied and just use one side as sort of the opening. We're not choshesh because it's easier for him to undo both and just to take the rope off. Alternatively, the Tosfos Yontif brings from Rashi in Kufya Beis on base explains that we're talking about a situation where you've got some sort of enclosure and the door is simply not there. It's fallen off or it's being repaired. And this is a temporary sort of fix that a person would take a rope and tie it on both sides. That we're not choshish that he's going to leave one side there permanently, because sooner or later the door is going to be repaired and it's going to be put back onto this enclosure, and therefore he doesn't need the rope anymore. So therefore we're not choshish that he's going to leave it there permanently. So again, there's no problems of kosher and matzah over here. Continues the Mishnah. Kosher in a deli befiskiyah. A person may tie a bucket with a belt of a lo bechevel, but not with a rope. So imagine you've got a well. So Rabbi Yehuda Matir. So imagine you've got a well and you've got a bucket. You want to sort of lower it into the well to draw out water. So the rope is gone. You've got to tie it to connect the bucket to something in order to lower it down. So you're allowed to do it, says the Mishnah, with a belt on Shabbos, because we're not worried that's going to be a permanent knot, because the guy wants his belt back. So therefore it'd be mutter to tie the knot to connect the bucket, the pail, with his belt, to lower it down into the water, because we're not choshesh that he's going to leave it there permanently. Masha'inken chevel, a rope, we are worried, because we're worried that a person would leave the rope there permanently, and therefore he could have been over an Issa Deraisa on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda, however, allows it. Now the Bartanura explains from the Gemara that this is referring to a chevel gardi. Says the Bartanura, Rabbi Yehuda matir, lo hit Rabbi Yehuda el bechevel shel gardi. He doesn't permit you to tie this bucket, this pail, with a regular rope, only a weaver's rope. Shetzorech lo lemlachto. Because Rabbi Yehuda says we're not worried that the weaver is going to leave it there, because he needs this weaving rope for his work. V'lo mevatale hosom. So what about the Rabbanon? Why do they argue? For Rabbanon Sovri, Isharis lechevel shel gardi, if we allow to use this chevel shel gardi, yiksher nami b'shar chavolim, we're worried that he might come to tie other ropes. The chevel b'chevel michlef, people will confuse different types of ropes. Chevel gardi, a regular chevel, he might get confused. It's a gezerah, and the halacha is like the chachomim. Concludes the Mishnah, Klal Omer Rabbi Yehuda. And the Mefarshim explain this is not connected to his previous comment, but rather a klal at the end of the Mishnah. Kol kesher she'ena shel kayoma ein chayovin olav. any kesher which is not shel kayama, which is not permanent, ein chayav nolav, we're not worried about it. So there are different perushim explaining what exactly this refers to. One interpretation is that Rabbi Yehuda is referring to a bow, and he says he does not differentiate between a knot, a kesher, or a bow and a niva, because both, if they're permanent, are going to be osa. The Chachamim, however, would differentiate, and they say no, dafka, a kesher, a knot is a problem, but a bow, if it's not a bow, even if it's permanent, would be okay. There are different ways of explaining this. That's one pshat in the Gemara in Kufyut Gimel Amud Aleph. That is the end of Mishnah base of Perek Tes Vav.